in middle school, across 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, I made a couple $100,000 from selling these stupid apps. I became very interested in kind of how we were going to interact with this new generation of technology. When I started Sensei, we chased a whole bunch of different applications, and the focus was just let's try and find money and interest to build out the core eye tracking technology. The standard of care in mental health is the equivalent of diagnosing someone with diabetes but never measuring their blood sugar.
So David, we've got to know each other in the last couple of weeks. It's been an interesting couple of weeks, and we'll talk about
it. Has, yeah.
We'll talk about it, how we got to get to spend time together. A lot more on the Zooms than on the face-to-face. But I guess we should obviously kick off the conversation with why we're here together. We'll start at the end, really.
Yeah.
So I have a new investment company, and you have a startup that's like 8 years old, 9 years old?
It depends if you count from when we incorporated or when we actually started doing real work. But yeah, it's somewhere between 7 and 10 years old, depending on how you want to count it.
So I want to start counting it from when you're in high school.
If we can go back even farther then.
Because that's really when the whole idea started to germinate, right?
Absolutely.
And it became such a passion that you actually skipped education.
Yeah.
To educate yourself on this, right?
Yeah.
So we met each other because I was investing in your company and you were courting my new investment company. But in the process, I think we've become quite good friends.
Absolutely.
And
those are the best deals.
Yeah, and you have a remarkable story. So I wanted you to tell your story. And let's start with your stutter, because I think that's foundational to where you are today.
Yeah. So it's funny because the stutter is not something I really think about that much anymore. It's the most frustrating part of my life, but it's not something I've thought about in a long time. But through therapy and other things that I've been doing, a lot of what middle school and high school was like has been kind of coming back up for me. But yeah, I have a bit of a stutter. It's it's the best it's ever been now. And I think doing a lot of public speaking and things has kind of forced me to learn how to deal with it. But when I was a kid, like the stutter, the stutter was terrible. I could basically, if I was lucky, get 2 or 3 words out before I would get stuck, and I couldn't really communicate everything. I don't remember when it started. My mom says it started in like kindergarten-ish. I remember 3rd and 4th grade because that's when I started having to go to speech therapy, and the school put me in speech therapy, and we had like a private speech therapist, and so twice a week I was doing speech therapy around it. But yeah, I don't really know how to view the stutter. I don't think I have a negative association with it now. But especially as a kid, like when you can't even say your own name without like getting stuck and stuttering, and people would say things like, well, like, how do you not even know your name? Like it was the most frustrating thing. Like the scariest thing for me in the world was going somewhere like Starbucks where you would have to like tell the barista your name, and then it become like a 2-minute affair of me getting stuck. And I eventually figured out that there were like random names I could say instead, and then I wouldn't get stuck stuttering on it. But yeah, I've had a stutter for a long time, but it's just drastically better now than it was.
I hope one of those names you didn't use was Farzad.
I did not use Farzad. No. It usually wasn't other Persian names.
Yeah. Well,
my parents were a little nicer than him, so my middle name is Babak. So I still got the Persian name, but they were nice enough to not make it my first name.
Yeah. Well, we've had a lot of fun with Farzad's name at Starbucks. But when I went to high school, my parents had enough of me, and they sent me off to boarding school in my second last year at school, just to get me out of the house because I was a handful. But I was the smallest guy in my class because not only was I a year and a half young for my class, but I was also a very small guy. And so, school in South Africa in those years was very, very, it was brutal. And so I was set upon by the bullies of the class quite frequently, and I formed a relationship with the biggest guy in our class out of sheer necessity. But he was a fantastic guy, and he had the most serious stutter I've ever seen in my life. I mean, he would eat his hands out trying to get the word out, and every sentence it would happen.
Yeah, I would kick.
You would kick, yeah.
And it's part of why, like, what it annoys a lot of people, and I don't really tell the full story, but you've seen this a lot of the time when I'm on conference calls. I'm walking around the block. I'm not sitting in front of my desk doing it. And there's many reasons for that, but one of it is if I can kind of just like kick my foot or squeeze my phone or do something like that to break the stutter if I'm in the middle of it.
Yeah. Well, we've kept in touch for all these years, and when I'm on the phone with him now, he's almost fluent, absolutely almost fluent. So it may be an age-related thing.
Maybe,
it's possible.
I think also, and I know everyone, I think a lot of people have different stutters, but for me, the most frustrating part of it, but now like the way I deal with it is you kind of know 3 or 4 words before the word you're going to stutter on that you're going to stutter on that word. And so it becomes a trick to kind of figure out what a word is that can mean the same thing that you can swap it with. And with names, it doesn't really work, obviously, but with other things, you can switch it out. And most of the time it works now. Well,
I will tell you that it's very similar to memory, because, I'm getting on in years. And so my memory, I even as a youngster, but all through my life, I've had a hard time remembering people's names. And so the word that you're going to struggle to find, even if, as you're forming the sentence in your mind.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, and as a result, you start thinking about how to get around using that word and still getting the sense of what you're going to say.
So you know the word so you don't know what the word is, obviously, but you know that the word that you're about to say, the context around it.
Exactly right, yeah.
That sounds just equally as frustrating.
Yeah. Well, we should work on that together next time you've got your scientist hat. So you put in a scientist hat as a sophomore. What? Yeah. So in high school.
Yeah. So I'll give you the backstory a little bit. So it was really started in middle school. So I was always interested by technology, and like I didn't really know what I was going to do when I was older, but like I always knew I wanted to do something in technology. And I remember when it was probably 2008. I want to say 2009, but I remember it was the Apple Developer Conference that year when they announced the App Store. And I forget who the Apple executive who was on stage, but they were talking through Xcode and the SDK that they were building for, iOS for iPhone apps. And like they were kind of showcasing how like easy it's going to be to make software relative to the way it worked before. And that got me really excited. And so I spent a very long time.
So you weren't at the conference, you watched.
This conference I wasn't at. Yeah, I must have been like 12 at this point.
Okay.
But I remember.
I was just wondering.
I was not at the conference. I was watching a recording of it on YouTube. But I remember I convinced. It took a long time. And my parents were like, we had computers in the house, but it was like, old school, always Windows. I remember spending a long time trying to convince my parents to buy a Mac because I wanted to kind of try this for myself. And so I finally got a Mac. I must have been in 6th or 7th grade. And I started to kind of teach myself how to build iPhone apps. I remember I bought Objective-C for Dummies. It was like the old school big book. And I taught myself how to code. And in no way did I make anything amazing. Like I would basically rip off a whole bunch of like games. So I had like Destroids, which was an asteroids ripoff. I did stuff like that. And then my app that was the most successful, which was also a copycat, but at that point, Apple had not put the emoji keyboard on the iPhone yet. You would have to buy an app from the App Store to install the emoji keyboard on your phone. I
remember that.
Yeah, and it was a relatively easy thing to code because like on Stack Overflow, everyone had talked about how to build this, but everyone was charging $4, $5, $10 for the emoji keyboard. So I just ripped it off and made a 99-cent version of it. And I made, like in middle school, across 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, I made a couple $100,000 from selling these stupid apps.
Couple of $100,000.
Yeah, it made a lot of money, like over the 3 years. And my parents were very nice. They let me go make like my own checking account, and I got to keep all the money.
Awesome.
But so that was like.
But you didn't buy Apple stock with it.
No, I wasn't. But hopefully the return I'll make from having ended up in my own startup will be worth more than Apple stock. But yeah. But so that got me very interested in like software development and technology. And by no way was I an expert, programmer, but I kind of figured out how to, what AI does now, but take 10 times longer, like read from Stack Overflow, read books, just figure out how to code certain things. So long story short, in middle school and kind of very early in high school, I was building apps as my outlet, and it became a way. It essentially became a business for me. And so in 10th, 2012, I guess it was. That was the year that Google was holding their developer conference. I was 15. And by some miracle, I convinced my parents to let me go to San Francisco alone. Wow. To attend the conference that year. And that happened to be the year that Google Glass was announced. And it was a whole thing. Sergey was on stage. They had skydivers jump onto the convention center. They were live streaming. It was this whole big thing. And everyone at that conference had the right to basically sign up to be one of the first 500 folks or so who received a pair of Google Glass. I think my actual glass block was number 523 because they gave you a glass block there. I think I haven't looked at it in a while, but I think that's what the number was. But then, and then there was a smaller group of us that were like invited to a couple of hackathons and whatnot. We got access a little bit earlier than everyone else, but essentially, by virtue of just having been at that conference that year, because I was building, iPhone and Google Play apps, I received a pair of Google Glass. I think it was 6 months or 9 months later, and I became very enamored by it for two reasons. One, I would wear it everywhere, and it was fun getting all the attention because it was, the hot topic item, and at that point, only 1,500 people in the country had them, and so I got invited to speak at a lot of hackathons, and I got to travel a bit because people would fly me out to speak about Google Glass, so that was fun. But I became very interested in kind of how we were going to interact with this new generation of technology, because as cool as Google Glass was, they got a cell phone, a netbook, whatever you want to call it, into a pair of glasses, essentially. The one thing that I thought was really stupid was that the best idea they had for how to interact with it was to basically slap a mouse pad on the side of your head, and that was like the primary way of interacting with it. You could talk to it too, but primarily it was kind of like scroll. And so that got me interested in the evolution of interface technology over time. So how we went from a keyboard on a typewriter to a mouse on a PC to a touchscreen on a phone, and and so on and so forth. And naturally, because Google Glass was a pair of glasses, it got me really interested in the eyes. And there was like a little infrared sensor or something there in Google Glass. You could blink, and that would take a picture essentially, which is kind of creepy when you think about it now. But that was essentially the only thing there. And so to me, naturally, because it was a pair of glasses, made a lot of sense. Like the eyes can kind of serve as that mechanism. And so while ultimately Google Glass didn't go anywhere, that kind of set me down a path of researching like how could the eyes potentially kind of serve as this next interface device. And what I essentially stumbled on is that there's almost 100 years of scientific literature that talks about all these different cognitive, emotional, and psychological states that can cause some sort of a change in the dilation of the pupil. But it's very difficult to do anything with that information because it's one black circle that gets bigger or smaller for all these different reasons, including just a change in light. And even in order to measure that one black circle, you need these very large, expensive eye trackers. And so that kind of set me down the journey of wanting to figure out if there's a way to use commercial off-the-shelf cameras instead of eye trackers to kind of unlock the potential of eye tracking, and B, let's find more variables in the eye to measure in order to kind of, make it work. And I had all sorts of crazy unscientific ideas of the way the iris and the pupil are connected and all the things we can measure, but it just kind of trial and error, try to kind of figure out what's there that we could measure.
So when did this intellectual process take place where you now are beginning to think about eye tracking and looking at the eye rather than looking out from the eye?
I can't tell you exactly when. It's hard to tell, but it was somewhere in when I was in 10th grade, essentially. So when I was in 10th grade, I hated school for many, many reasons. And I was basically my grades were, I got A's and I got D's. If I cared about your class, if I cared about the topic, I studied and I would get an A. And if I didn't give a shit, I would never turn in any piece of homework. And I would do good on the test and I would get a D in the class because of all the missing assignments.
We kind of intellectual twins because I had terrible ADHD, and it was never diagnosed as that. But, when I was at boarding school, you had to go to prep. You had to go do your studies and sit there for 2 hours in the afternoon or 1.5 hours in the evening. And it was even worse than sitting in a classroom. It was absolute bloody torture for me. I mean, real torture. No idea how painful it was.
Yeah.
And, I don't know if you had a similar kind of feeling, but for me, the only subjects I did well in are those that I absolutely intuited.
Yeah, I think the result was the same for me. But for me, it was more of like, and I'm like this with everything in life. Like I'm either a 0 or a 12 on the dial. There's no 1 through 11. Like if I care about something, like I'm all in. There's nothing to do to stop me. And if I don't care about something, there is nothing you will ever do to motivate me to care about it, because it's just the way my brain works. I don't. I'm sure it has something to do with addiction, but that's just the way my brain works. Yeah,
it may do. So, all right. So we're in sophomore in high school. You're starting to think about the eye, rather than looking outward from the eye. You're looking into the eye, and you're fascinated by it. You also understand that eye trackers can actually do that. Talk about eye trackers. What are eye trackers?
So like eye trackers and the eye tracking space has been around for a very long time. I'm not an expert on the overall space, but essentially there's been a couple of big companies in the space. Toby's probably the most well-known. There was another company called SMI. I think Apple bought them in 2012 or 2013. And there's a couple other kind of like smaller
Does Nidec
players
fit into that space?
Who, sorry?
Nidec. They're a Japanese company. I don't know
that I know Nidec, but the name sounds similar about it. But yeah, essentially, like eye tracking traditionally has been primarily focused on gaze, and essentially, it's using these very specialized cameras or camera systems to essentially see where the eye is looking. I think the most like well-known application of eye trackers is like in market research. So either if it's like online market research or like cameras inside of like of stores, it's very focused on essentially trying to identify where someone is looking, and based on where they're looking and what they're looking at, you can kind of derive attention and arousal and things like that. So like if you have a website and you're trying to figure out how to put something you want to sell in the right kind of arena, eye tracking is a very powerful way to understand exactly what they're looking at and what they're excited about and how to place things in certain ways to kind of help sell. And there's a lot of other applications for eye tracking, but market research, and especially like in-store and online market research, seems to be the place where it's always been the most impactful and successful.
So, but you're focused on eye tracking now for medical purposes.
Yeah, that's correct. And when I started Sensei, we chased a whole bunch of different applications, and the focus was just let's try and find money and interest to build out the core eye tracking technology. And then when we got it to a point where the eye tracking worked and we felt confident that the science behind the eye tracking itself on a mobile phone or a normal camera was valid, we then decided to figure out like what the best application we wanted to focus is on. And we settled on mental health at that point. But the focus for a long time was very much on let's just build the core eye tracking itself.
So just before we try and focus on what you're doing, just explain to us what is so unique about the eye that it allows you to related to for medical purposes.
Yeah, so I'll give you the David answer. I think a neuroscientist would give you a much more in-depth answer, but there's always kind of two things I think about. The first is like, if you think about like when you watch any of the videos where it's like, egg and sperm meet and it gets fertilized and like the whole thing from that all the way to 9 months, at some point very early in the process when the baby is being developed, you see like a big ball of cells, and then you see these like two horns come out of it essentially. And that big ball of cells is the brain, and you see basically the optic nerve is coming out. And so from all intents and purposes, the eye is a part of the brain, and it's the only internal organ that we can actually see externally. And so we've known for a very long time that all sorts of cognitive, emotional, and psychological activity that shows up or affects the brain is somehow showing up in the eyes. It's not it's not so straightforward that it's like, you know, if you have a certain mental health condition or you're feeling a certain emotion, your eye is going to look different, or you are blinking different, or your pupil size is different. But when you show different types, of stimuli, depending on what's going on, the eye and the brain will respond in different ways. And there's like a very famous functional MRI study. I think it was at Harvard, but it could have been somewhere else, where they showed people like Forrest Gump and Finding Nemo, these very emotional movies, inside of an fMRI, and mapped out what's going on. And there's been a lot of eye tracking studies that have done the same thing. And so it's kind of in response to stimuli, you can kind of suss out these different cognitive, emotional, and psychological states, both, you know, in the brain and something like an fMRI, and also through eye tracking.
So we know that, or I know, and I'm sure many people know, that when you go to get your eyeglasses fitted, that they put you in front of these big machines and they're looking at your eyes. Is that eye tracking, or is that something completely different?
I don't think that's eye tracking. I know like there's a couple different machines that, like, I know one of them is looking like at the back of your retina. I don't think those types of things are more eye tracking. But they're very much focused at looking at structures in the eye. But yeah, I don't think those are kind of typically considered eye tracking. Like, eye tracking is more focused on mapping what you're like, is mapping where you're looking compared to kind of certain stimuli that's being presented. I think like the most obvious example of eye tracking is like, you know, like the old Palm Pilots. Yeah. If you got a new stylus, you have to basically, you know, calibrate it and tap the dots. Traditional eye tracking is things like that, but essentially you're following the dots with your eyes instead of a stylus. That's kind of the most, like the simplest type of eye tracking task.
So what can eye tracking do for us? I mean, if firstly, what kind of equipment do they use for eye tracking right now, and what does it do for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to, and I think we'll get to this later, but like what Senseye is doing is well beyond just traditional eye tracking, because eye tracking is very much focused on like gaze, sometimes pupil, but traditionally when you say eye tracking, it's very much focused on tracking the eye and looking at where the eye is looking externally.
Gotcha.
Kind of like essentially like trying to use the, you know, eye as a mouse. Whereas what Senseye is focused on is looking at what's going on inside of the eye, at least as far as the surface level features, and using that to interpret what's going on inside of the brain. So, you know, gaze is one of the many things we look at, but it's only one of the things that we look at.
So if you're looking at all these things with the camera from the phone, what does it do that other machines can't do? And
yeah, so in terms of what Senseye looks at, there's kind of three main categories. So the first is all of the conventional ocular metrics you would think of. Things like pupil size, blinks, saccades, gaze, eye movement, nystagmus, a lot of these kind of traditional ocular metrics. Nystagmus is what a cop is looking for on the side of the road. It's like a jitter of the eye, and if it's there, it shows you're intoxicated, apparently. Okay. It's kind of that kind of type of movement.
Gotcha.
The second category is a little bit more novel, and we're still very, very early here, but essentially the iris of the eye is controlled by two sets of muscles. There's the dilator and the sphincter. The dilator is innervated by the sympathetic nervous system, and the sphincter by the parasympathetic. And so we try to get a lot more granularity into what part of the nervous system is actually being activated by the stimuli we're showing. And then the third is we also look at heart rate and heart rate variability off the face. And so there's about, depending on the exact thing we're looking at, between like 30 and 45 individual metrics that we're looking at. And then all those metrics combined in a multimodal manner is what we're using to kind of get to, you know, the diagnosis of the brain state that we're looking at. Traditional eye tracker, to kind of directly answer your question before we go into Senseye, traditional eye trackers can really only do one or a couple of those things. So like there are a lot of high-end eye trackers that are really good for gaze. Some are very good for pupil. Some are good for pupil and gaze. But there isn't really an eye tracking system that can measure all of those things simultaneously. And there certainly isn't one that can measure all those things or most of those things in in an affordable manner. Like, and when I say affordable, like if you're trying to build something that can be used by, every American, there's no way to get a VR headset or an eye tracker. Every American, I think we're a long way away from that, especially if it's only for one application. And so our focus, and this has been the most difficult part of what we're doing, is that we want to be able to do everything that we're doing on the cameras and the equipment that everyone already has in their houses. And so our focus right now is delivering via cell phone, because the joke we always make is even a homeless person at this point has a cell phone most of the time. And so you can really reach the entire population if you can build something that works on a cell phone.
But what does it do? What is the functional outcome of this? You got eye tracking. What does it tell you?
Can I pitch Sensei now? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the overall problem that Sensei is trying to solve is that everyone knows that we're in a mental health crisis in America and across the world.
Right.
There's many reasons why we're in a crisis, and we're not pretending we can solve it on our own. But the one thing I find really funny is all these companies that talk about we're doing precision psychiatry. We're building these drugs that are going to target these incredibly specific things, and it's going to solve everything in mental health. And I always laugh when I hear that because in oncology, precision medicine right now makes a lot of sense. You can build a drug that's targeting this one specific mutation or whatever it may be. In mental health, all we have are questionnaires. We have nothing. So how are you doing precision medicine based off of a bunch of nonsense questionnaires that can be that have been proven to not be the most accurate things in the world? And
so a questionnaire is a diagnostic tool?
Yeah, all we have to diagnose mental health off these days are questionnaires, and
really?
Yeah, that's all that's being used in the real world is questionnaires.
What about MRI? Is it just too expensive, or?
I think you can certainly use that to aid in the diagnosis, but it's too expensive and not scalable. So most of mental health is being diagnosed off of, or all of mental health really is being diagnosed off of questionnaires, and you can put it in kind of two different categories. On the one side are these very long-form diagnostic interviews. So for something like PTSD, using a full SCID and an assessment called the CAPS-5, these are generally very accepted and accurate ways to diagnose mental health, but they have a couple of problems. It takes a long time. So the CAPS-5 on its own is roughly about an hour. A clinician also has to score it. If you do it, but to administer the CAPS-5, you have to have already thought they had PTSD. So there's a lot of other assessments you do first. You might do something like a full SCID. That whole package of assessments plus the clinician scoring it takes hours and hours, and it requires a very specialized psychologist or psychiatrist who's been trained in how to use it and can also be co-rated and backed up by an additional clinician. That's really the only way to make sure it's accurate. So because it's time-consuming and a pain in the butt and still subjective, it's not really used in the real world. What ends up happening in the real world, and in the United States, about 75% of all mental health is diagnosed and treated exclusively in primary care. So most patients never even make it to a specialist. We just use these patient self-reported questionnaires. The standard questionnaires are the PHQ-9, which is a depression questionnaire, and the GAD-7, which is for anxiety. Those are, it asks questions like, in the last 2 weeks, have you been, uninterested in simple things? It asks those types of questions you've taken at one point or another. And that's what we use to diagnose anxiety and depression off of.
Really?
Yeah, that's really it. That's the system. And
so there's no instrument you can, like a blood pressure meter or?
There's nothing objective in this space right now. That's the analog I always use is, the standard of care in mental health is the equivalent of diagnosing someone with diabetes but never measuring their blood sugar. Huh. That's essentially what it is. And this is anecdotal, but for most patients, essentially, you go to a doctor's office, you take the questionnaire, they call it anxiety, they call it depression, you test positive, you get an SSRI or Xanax or a benzo, and that's the end of the road for them. That's essentially where it starts and stops. And the questionnaires are highly inaccurate, but let's suspend disbelief for a second. Let's say the questionnaires are 100% accurate. The other big problem is these questionnaires can only screen for anxiety or depression. And almost every mental health condition has comorbid anxiety and or depression. So everyone that has something screens for anxiety or depression, we treat it as anxiety or depression. Yeah. And then we think we have this big chronic anxiety and depression population, which never gets better. And I'm sure some of that really is that. But if I was a betting man, I would assume that the overwhelming majority of that, it's real, but it's undiagnosed or misdiagnosed something else. And like, in the case of PTSD, a lot of the literature talks about the average journey of a PTSD patient from when they enter the mental health system is roughly 7 years until they correctly get diagnosed as having PTSD. Because right now, the only way that we can tell it's PTSD is if you make a trauma disclosure. And even then, it's still subjective because the clinician has to decide if they think that the traumatic thing that you disclosed is traumatic enough to meet what's called a criterion A event. And only if you disclose the trauma and it hits that requirement, will it be called and treated as PTSD. And the issue is like your whole pitch to a patient is, hey, tell me the most traumatic thing that ever happened to you, and then in 30 minutes, I'm going to kick you out of my office and never see you again. Like that's not really something you want to do. It takes time to build that therapeutic alliance to get someone to disclose that type of thing. And so, yeah, it's a bit long-winded, but
so all this mental disease that we seem to be having this problem with in the country, what you're telling me is that we're not diagnosing it, and therefore we may be mistreating it. And
yeah, I don't think so. So I don't see how we like. There are many companies and many scientists doing amazing things in mental health, but I don't see how we can make any real dent in this space until someone solves the measurement problem. And I know diagnostics are boring and they're not sexy and investors don't like them for all sorts of reasons, but the reason why we're so focused on building diagnostics, and I say that word diagnostic, like we're not trying to build a screening tool, we're not trying to build a wellness device. We have committed to the hell that is building a medical device and getting it through the FDA as a diagnostic, because we see no way to make any change in the space unless you can solve the measurement problem first. Precision medicine, all these things are very possible and will have a very big impact if you can build the core measurement layer first, which I think has two important components. Component one is diagnostics. Right. You have to be able to know what the patient has because, someone going to therapy is not there are different ways that you need to treat these different conditions, whether it's therapy or a drug or a hybrid, but like you need to know what the thing actually is. Like talk therapy is very helpful, but talk therapy, if you think the person has something they don't or it's misdiagnosed, you might not be taking the right approach even. And then the second part is being able to measure severity over time so you actually know if the patient's getting better or not in response to treatment, whatever that intervention is. Because every week, like my therapist would ask me every week, like, are you feeling any better yet? I'm like, what the hell? How am I supposed to know? I need you to tell me that. And it was always the most frustrating thing. But like, and I think that's true. Like, how are you supposed to know what equals feeling better versus not? Or like, I haven't taken medications, but like, if a medication is working or not, like you ask the patient, like, do you want to increase your dose? Do you want to decrease your dose? Like, how are they supposed to know what it's supposed to be like? And so having an objective measure of like, this is the condition, it's getting better, it's getting worse. Like, I think that is the most important and impactful thing needed in this space. And we have to talk about it at first from like this FDA very, very clinical standpoint of we're measuring, like in the case of PTSD, we're measuring the equivalent of a CAPS 5R score. So you can tell if the patient's severity is getting better or getting worse. But flip it on its side, or upside down, you can also look at from like the professional athlete model of like, what are the factors that lead to me being at my best mental health or my PTSD being the most manageable, and it could be a combination like, sleep, exercise, and nutrition are kind of like the three most impactful things for your mental health. I think we forget about a lot or ignore. Like I know they are, but my sleep and nutrition is garbage. But like what are the factors between those types of things and and medication and therapy that like leads you to build your best life? And that's really how I would like describe the mission of what we're trying to do at Sensei is like, I know firsthand from my own experience, but also from a lot of second and third hand experiences, how mental health can like, even the simplest mental health issues that like might not even meet the definition of a particular condition can like stop you in your tracks and not allow you to live your best life. And that's what I really see is what we're trying to do at Sensei is enable every human to get a hold of their mental health and live their best lives. And it starts with measurement, and then we can build everything else on top of that.
So you started a business functionally as a sophomore in middle school and never went to college, or did you?
So I left high school after 10th grade. This doesn't exist anymore. They've changed it. But back when I was in 10th grade, there was something called the California High School Exit Exam, which was originally made for child actors so they can leave high school early.
Right.
But essentially you can take this test, and if you pass this test, which is a joke of a test, but if you take a test, you can basically leave high school after 10th grade. So I took that test. I left high school after 10th grade. I enrolled in Santa Monica College, and the plan was I was going to go to college. Like, it was not this grand master vision of I was going to quit high school because I had this business idea, but I enrolled in Santa Monica College. I took classes there for about a year because that was a deal with my parents. Like, let me leave high school, and I'll go to college. Like, I'm sick of this place. And then somewhere along the line, I just didn't enroll for another semester, and I decided not to transfer. So I just kind of took about a semester or two and just kind of slowly started working on Sensei. And I'm not of the opinion of education is dumb and garbage. I think there's a lot of issues with our education system, but doing what we do at Sensei, we employ a lot of neuroscientists and psychologists and a lot of positions where you cannot learn those things without going through the proper educational route. But for me, I just kind of slowly led into I'm just going to stop and focus on Sensei. And if it doesn't work out, I can always go back to school, but I think I have an opportunity to figure this thing out right now. And so started working on that.
Will you still go back to school? Yeah.
I'm actually slowly going back. I'm finishing my degree online right now, actually. But
but you probably at a doctorate level in the field that you're in.
Well, I'm not studying in the field that I'm in just because I want to get the piece of paper very quickly. But then I would like to actually properly study clinical psychology, and so I'm quickly finishing my bachelor's so that I could study that in a part-time capacity as this journey
kind of. You're doing this while you're doing your startup?
Very, very part-time, but yeah.
Oh my God, that to me figures on close to the impossible. How many hours a day do you work?
I think on average I probably work 12 hours a day, I would say, and then a bit on the weekends as well. But I have learned that if I can get in a deep state for 4 or 5 hours, that's much more impactful than if I'm right. So I try to do all my meetings in the morning and then use the afternoon into the evening, just kind of sit down and work through whatever's going on. But as you know, we've been in the middle of fundraising, and we've kind of just finished fundraising, and so I was kind of the full-time fundraiser for a long time, and so now I'm kind of learning how to be a CEO again, because for a long time, fundraising was the biggest focus just because it kind of has to be sometimes in a startup. There's no one else that can do it other than the CEO.
So give us a bit of your background.
Yeah.
So I know that your family's originally from Iran.
Yeah. So my family is originally from Iran. So my mom and dad are both from Iran. The dad, this might be TMI, but if I don't say this, I feel like I'm living a lie. So basically, I found out later on that I'm actually from a sperm donor. So my biological dad, who I don't know, I just know a couple of things from the sperm bank. He's from Iraq, but the dad that I grew up with is also from Iran, and then my mom is from Iran. I grew up in a Persian Jewish family in Los Angeles, which is basically all the Persians came from Iran in 1979.
Right.
Half of them basically ended up in New York on Long Island. Half ended up in LA. There's a random contingency in Ohio. And we're kind of all around. But yeah, I grew up in with all the Persians that had moved over.
So you were born in the U.S. or you were born in?
I was born in Los Angeles. Yeah, I was the first generation of my family that was born in the U.S. Yeah.
And your parents, are they professionals? What are they?
Yeah. So my dad, the dad that I grew up with, all Middle Eastern men, was in the import-export business. And if you asked him, he would say import-export because they're always very cagey about it.
Right.
He ran a textile business, so they would import textiles from China and Thailand and stuff, and then they were a wholesale seller. My mom worked at a bank. She quit when I was born. And she was a stay-at-home mom for a while, and then she got in. She was working for a private mortgage broker as a mortgage agent. That went to hell in 2008, right. 2009. And then she went back to school and became a psychologist, actually. She did think she was a psychologist even before she was a psychologist and was always psychoanalyzing everyone and anything, which is a giant pain in the ass growing up with that. But then she became a real psychologist,
Right.
Or I guess a therapist, not a psychologist, but yeah.
So actually it's all in the family.
More or less, yeah. Although I have some views on the way she does therapy, but yeah. Hopefully she won't listen to this.
She could have used a sensei.
Probably.
Yeah. So here we are today. You've had this incredible journey where you've skipped college, you skipped school, and then you skipped college, and you started your startup as a young man. And my observation is that it's one of the best operated startups I've seen for a long time. It has a very high level of discipline. The financials are kept in much greater detail and much greater diligence than I see in most startups. So along the way, did you study business? Did you read? How did you get to be such a good operator?
Yeah, I think the internet. So first of all, thank you for saying that, and I appreciate that. And I think a lot of that is a function of the team that we've built more than it is of me.
Oh.
But yeah, I think like along the way, like I've just had to pick up and learn a bunch of stuff, and like the internet is is a great resource. So like we, so like when I first started Sensei, I hired just 2 employees. But you got to pay the employees. And so I learned how payroll works and how to run payroll. And then we had to start keeping books. And so I hired like a part-time accountant, and she used QuickBooks. And so I learned how to use QuickBooks from that. And just kind of like when I saw a P&L for the first time, I had her explain to me what all the lines are and how it works. And so a lot of it was kind of just like picked up over time. Like the way I think about my job, and I think I've seen like the startup CEO, because like I'm slowly getting to this point, but like, like I think like a startup CEO, when you're less than 25 employees, you're more like a chief project manager than you are like a big company CEO, because there's still a lot of functions where I myself have to run the function, right? Like it's not, I don't have a huge executive team doing everything. But so the way I always think about it is like, I take on these different jobs and these different functions. I do a shitty job for as long as possible. And then when that function can no longer be done in a shitty way, I then have to hire a professional who knows how to do it, right? So like, sales, accounting, marketing, whatever it is, I've done those functions, and then I had to hire someone to kind of take it over. So yeah, I've just kind of had to, there hasn't been like one go-to resource, but like as I've had to learn different things, I've just kind of, this was before ChatGPT, but like, I've Googled and I've watched YouTube videos, or I've had whatever fractional or consulting help that we've had, like teach me how to do it as they've been doing it. And like, so like on the accounting front, after just asking accounting the same question a million times of like the hardest thing for me to learn was the difference between GAAP financials and cash based when we had to make the change, and like how you accrue things made 0 sense to me. But eventually, after asking a million times of like, why do you do this like this and all that, I just kind of have picked it up and have learned.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And
we have a very good team now, and like our chief neuroscientist, her name is Caitlin. Like she's been on the team for almost 6 years at this point, or 7 years at this point. So, and you met her this morning, I think. But yeah, but like we have a very good team in place that like knows how to do their respective work. And I've gotten very lucky, as through places like Capital Factory, through places like our investors. I've met a lot of really expert operators in this space who have either formally or informally like assisted and mentored me in different ways. And I have like the first like real and like institutional investor who invested in Sensei. It's a guy named, and there were a couple, but he wrote a big enough check that I kind of, I focused on him. Is a guy named Paul Santos. He runs a fund called a Wavemaker. And he, like, I wasn't even 21 when he invested. But he probably was like the first investor who not only like wrote a check, but got very hands-on in wherever I needed him, and kind of like taught me a lot of these things and mentored me. And like even now, like he's mentoring me on more life things, I would say. Like he's trying to teach me how to be more present and things like that. But like he really kind of like took me on, and like obviously in his best interest, because he wanted Sensei to be successful, but like he kind of stuck through all the good and the bad, and like was really focused on these types of things with me.
So we're here at Capital Factory.
Yeah.
And in Austin, Texas. And you're not from Austin, Texas.
No, yeah, I moved here about eight years ago.
What brought you to Austin? Why Austin?
Yeah, so when we were first trying to do fundraising and whatnot in 2017, Josh Bayer and the Capital Factory team, which Capital Factory was much smaller at that point, but the Capital Factory team did a $100,000 Move Your Startup to Austin challenge. And one of my small angel investors, a guy named David Carbutt, was invested in another company that was a Capital Factory company, saw it, sent it to me, said you should apply. And so this was like late February of 2017. I applied for the challenge, had a couple calls with them, got chosen as like one of the top 5 finalists. Came to Austin for like a pitch, ended up winning that day, the challenge, and then basically had moved to Austin 2 weeks later.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, what age were you when you got your first outside check?
So if we're not counting friends and family, we're talking like pure outside check. Probably 18, I would say.
18 years old.
Yeah.
Unschooled.
Yeah.
18 years.
And if you knew what I was pitching back then, like I was way in over my head compared to what we're actually pitching. Like back then, it was like, we have this idea and hopefully it's going to work. But like there was no business model or anything because I was like, there's no point in spending time figuring out a business model right now when it's going to take 4 or 5 years to figure out if a technology is even possible. So my pitch was very focused on like, here's the idea and I think we can make it work. And then we'll figure out what to do with it later on.
And just for my interest, how do we track from looking out through glasses to looking into the eye?
So the idea was, so I was never focused on looking out, actually. It was always focused on looking in. The thought was, so Google Glass is a pair of glasses. They have this little infrared sensor that can tell if you blink to take a picture. Can we use a camera like that looking at the eye to do all sorts of additional things? And then so that's what set me down the journey of looking through all the existing scientific literature that talks about, the eye and, the eye and its, how different things in the brain will change things in the eye, and everyone looking at pupil size and blink rate and these things. Yeah.
These are thoughts going through your mind in high school?
Yeah. Was much more interesting than whatever nonsense was being taught in class, but yeah.
That's it. I mean, this is fascinating.
Yeah, and I also had very supportive teachers. Some of my teachers, so like,
really?
Yeah, so like there's a couple of teachers that like have been very remarkable throughout my life. In high school, I had 2. I had a 9th grade English teacher who's, I think his name was Mr. Schlanger, something like that. But he was, I got away with all sorts of shit in his class, and he let me get away with it because he knew I was more interested in other stuff. But he was a great teacher. And then in 10th grade, I had a physics teacher. His name was Mr. Schmafe. And he was an amazing teacher. And he knew that I had got a pair of Google Glass, and he was like, can you bring it to school? Because I want to see with it and play with it. And he was really good. And then I had a teacher named Mr. Burr, who was my 10th grade AP World History teacher. And I would like stay after school in his class every day and we like chat about technology and cell phones and all these things. And so I was, in many ways, I was also like encouraged by my teachers to kind of like look at all this stuff and just kind of like, yeah, I don't know. There was a lot of things like that. And I had a middle school teacher who was very impactful too, but.
And what are your grades like through all of this?
A's and D's.
So
I got D's in Spanish because I just didn't give a shit. Not that I didn't care about. I just wasn't interested in learning a new language at that point. I was like, I'm good with Farsi and English. And then so like physics, I got physics. I think I did pretty well in physics. Like the sciences and the history, I did pretty good in because I was interested in the class. But I would always do good on tests. It just was. If I didn't care about your class, I wasn't doing homework. And so I would get a lot of missing assignments. Yeah. But also, and then like by 10th grade, I knew that I wasn't going to like finish high school. I knew I was going to take this test and leave. And so I kind of felt emboldened of like, this doesn't really matter.
And now that you're studying, post college level stuff, how do you find, how do you maintain interest in the subject when you've got so many things going on in your real life?
So I'm finishing my undergrad right now in essentially like aeronautical science or aviation, which I have a very big passion for flying. I've had my pilot's license and my flight instructor's license for, I don't know, almost 10 years now. There are some boring topics, but there's also some very interesting topics. And
so what got you interested in flying in Illinois?
I always liked flying. Flying was like always, I don't know, I just always like looking up and like seeing airplanes, and like I was enamored by it. As soon as I started making a little bit of money, I started taking flight lessons, and I just didn't tell the flight school I was under 18, and they didn't think to check my license. And you can get a pilot's license earlier than 18 anyways,
Right.
But I just kind of started taking flight lessons. They don't tell my parents because there's no way my mom would ever let me get away with that. But yeah, I fell in love with it. I was very slow to like actually commit to it. I just kind of like took fun lessons with an instructor, one-offs as I go travel different places. And then at some point I was like, I want to do this. And so I got my private pilot's license, and like the way my brain works, like I can't have a private pilot's license when there's a higher level of pilot's license. It's the same way like I can't run a half marathon when other people are running full marathons. So I ended up getting my private pilot's license. I got my instrument rating, which like allows you to fly in clouds shortly after. And then I got my commercial pilot's license, and I got my flight instructor's license. And it was a combination of like falling in love with it and also realizing it's a very expensive hobby. But if I become a flight instructor, I can fly other people's airplanes and get paid for it. So
you're a flight instructor by night or by weekend?
I fly a lot less now than I used to before. Like if I have to go to a meeting in Dallas, though, like I'll take a little airplane up and fly there. But I don't flight instruct that often anymore. But I'm part of a nonprofit organization called the Civil Air Patrol, and I do like from here and there. I do a lot of flight instruction and administration of check rides, like in that organization essentially. But I can schedule ahead of time, so it works well. So that's like everyone needs a hobby to kind of like take their minds off things. And for me, flying is a great one because it's like the one thing I do that requires complete focus. And so it can actually turn my brain off away from work for a little bit.
So that's what you do for fun?
Yeah. So I probably fly 25, 30 hours a month, something like that. So not a lot, but not a little. Yeah.
And there's some work you have to do to keep abreast of what's going on in the flight.
Exactly. And I didn't know when I started flying how much the tech industry and flying have like overlap.
Right.
There's a lot of overlap of like entrepreneurs and flying. I don't know what it is about it, but it's a very interesting field.
Yeah. Well, it's trying to change the laws of gravity. I mean, It's trying to, compete with physics itself. Right. So what's the future, David? Where are you going? What do you see for your company?
Yeah. So I always tell people you and I both know the founder of Teladoc very well. And like Teladoc was like his 11th company or something. And he's had like 5 or 6 more since then. A couple of them very successful, such as Teladoc. I am not a serial entrepreneur. I am enjoying this phase of life. We still have a long way to go, but I'm enjoying this phase of life way more than I did like day one trying to figure out what the hell I was doing. So I'm very focused on like, I want to build Sensei into a generational company that can both stand on its own and like outlive all of us essentially. And so we're very focused right now on, on building diagnostics. We're starting with PTSD, anxiety and depression are a fast follow behind it. And I don't know quite where the wall of the technology is, where the wall of the science is, but I want to build, diagnostics and severity monitoring tools for as many of these conditions as possible. And then if you imagine a world 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, where tens of millions or hopefully hundreds of millions of patients a year are being diagnosed and their severity is being tracked through Sensei, there's going to be a ton of value in having access to all of that data. And so I hope we can do things like, and some earlier than others, but like, if we can do subtyping and phenotyping and like actually figure out not just I can tell you have PTSD, but I can figure out the exact subtype of the PTSD you have. Is it the avoidance cluster, the hypervigilance, and then help better match treatments based off of that. Whether it's doing treatment recommendations or partnering with, drug manufacturers to actually identify what drugs can specifically target these different types of subtypes. Or from a population health management standpoint, if we know what conditions are most pervasive where, from an insurance standpoint, if we understand the true cost and the time to kind of treat a lot of these indications. I think there's a lot we can do to turn Sensei from the mental health diagnostics company, which is kind of phase 1 right now, into the mental health company. And I think we can, if we execute properly, we can build it into that. We can take the company public, and this can become a very large company that will hopefully have a very large kind of, impact on the world. Because if this works, and especially at that scale for a whole host of indications, I think there's very few lives on this planet it won't have a positive impact on. And so I'm very focused on kind of trying to build Sensei into that. And I would love to run it for as long as I possibly can. And I think it's going to be a difficult task because I will have to learn at twice the rate as Sensei is growing to keep up for it. And if it gets to the point where not, then, we can talk about someone else running it and me moving into a different role in the company. But my life's work at this point is definitely Sensei. And I would like to, as long as I'm working, I want to stay and grow with the company. And some of my investors will probably watch this and freak out that I don't want to sell the company earlier. But I think the best value for all of our, because the way I think about it, there's a mental model of there's not just one constituency I serve as a CEO, right? There's our customers, there's our employees, there's our shareholders, and you have to balance these things. You can't always balance them perfectly, but I do think from a exit standpoint for the investors, from a growth standpoint for the company being standalone and going IPO, I think is the best opportunity for everyone. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping we can do.
Well, it's a very inspiring life. I'm fascinated by the journey. I'd love to see you reach this state, and then watch what's next for David.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, David.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks for having me.